There's a question from Amna Widad Nasuf. For updating a Cochrane review, do I have to write a new protocol, or do I have to follow the published review, and can I modify the published protocol? James, this is, I think, more in the spirit of your talk, although I've looked at the answer in terms of what the handbook says, but do you have any thoughts yourself?
I'll come off mute. It's going to be one of those, it depends, though there will be specific editorial processes to consider. I think that there are benefits above and beyond sort of like this pre-specification of writing a protocol in terms of, the pre-specification and avoidance of bias. I think that many of the reasons that I mentioned might well apply when you're doing starting on update. What I tend to find is that if it's a fairly I don't know about straightforward update, but if it's an update where the scope of the review isn't shifting, then checking the protocol to check that it's still is fit for its purpose is a good place to start. But I do tend to see quite a lot of updates where the focus of the review is shifting, and for there I'd have thought that a new protocol would be a good idea.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on.
What does the guidance say? Did you?
Well, it's a bit vague. It says, where changes to the review methods are substantive, authors are encouraged to write a complete updated protocol. So it's very much, and it depends, and it will be subject to some negotiation, I imagine, with the review group. But I think some things like, moving from the old to the new risk of bias assessment tool would not require a new protocol, but changing the eligibility criteria somewhat or deciding to include a full network meta-analysis might be the sort of situation when you move to a new protocol. Yeah. There are a couple of questions, Sue, from Sheila Wallace and Sophie Julien, about the relationship between Pico for the synthesis and subgroup analyses. Are they the same thing, or what's the difference in terms of pre-planning subgroup analyses?
Yeah, I think this is a question that we probably had lots of discussion about in writing the handbook chapter. The process, if I think about the specifics of the process we've described in the handbook, a lot of it is based on the conceptual work we do in defining groups for our synthesis that may directly be used as part of our subgroup analysis, but it might not be. And so if I take a step back to how we came about thinking about some of those issues, in our Cochrane training, we always talk to people about doing broad versus narrow reviews, and we suggest that our decision around whether we've done a broad or narrow review is determined by our review Pico. And in fact, I don't think that is the case. I think whether we answer broad or narrow questions is determined by our synthesis. And so what we're thinking about here is getting people to really specify the questions they want to answer within their review much more carefully, if you like, and in more detail. If I take the example that I used in the presentation around exercise for osteoporosis, for example, the first issue is thinking about how are you going to separate out the groups? What are the important intervention groups that you want to consider in the review? And there's a bunch of conceptual work you will do around that to, first of all, decide what those groups are, to define those groups so that you can actually apply them within your review. There's a second question, and we deal with this in the later stage of the process, which is how you will actually deal with that in your analysis. Will you deal with that, the different groups, by conducting subgroup analysis? Will you separate them out in different meta-analyses? Because the way in which you handle them in your analysis will address different questions. And in that OP example, they actually didn't do any subgroup analyses. They conducted completely separate analyses for each type of intervention. So they actually didn't look at whether or not the type of exercise was an effect modifier, for example. So there are two separate issues. The first is the conceptual one, and what we're really hoping people will achieve there is to specify the broad questions that they will address within their review, not at the review level overall, when they're writing their protocol. And I think that is a different thing, but the reason why it comes up, the question about the subgroup analysis comes up so often, is I think that's the only placeholder for thinking about how you'll group things within your synthesis that we have in the protocol at the moment. And I think that might be an issue because it leads us perhaps not to fully specify the comparisons that we'll make, not to specify the interventions or outcomes within those comparisons.
Absolutely. So it's a broader framework than just thinking about subgrouping. Joe, do you have any suggestions? There are a number of interesting questions about qualitative synthesis, although I do want to restrict the discussion to issues of protocols and pre-specification. Joe, have you got any suggestions for questions, having looked at them?
Yes, so I think there's an interesting question really perhaps for James, but maybe for others also, around when preparing a Cochrane review protocol, is it advisable to search for existing systematic reviews in order to familiarize yourself with the topic? Or do you think that there's too much of a risk of introducing bias by doing so?
Yeah, I saw that question. I thought it was a great question because, of course, you can ask the question in the abstract, but what happens if you have, if you weren't even thinking about doing a review at the time, but you've already read the reviews? So I think it highlights what I was saying earlier, which was we can't necessarily eliminate all of these potential sources of bias, but what these processes enable us to do is to become more sensitive to them. There's no real answer to that question. If you seek out reviews in your area, it would help you and help you to potentially do a more informed review. But if you go and read reviews which all tell you what the finding of your review is likely to be, it's hard to I don't know. It's hard not to know what those reviews are saying. So I think that it's a great question, and I think that ideally we want to be making our decisions without knowing what the findings of the other reviews are saying. But in in real world, that's not always possible. We have to be aware of the potential of that pre-knowledge for influencing the way that we do the review.
Okay. I see. There's a question maybe Angela might want to take. That's about this notion of Pico synthesis. Is it useful in a narrative synthesis within a mixed methods review? I assume that means mixed methods in terms of combining quantitative and qualitative evidence. Angela, is that anything you've thought about? I don't hear you, Angela.
I haven't seen the question. I can't see the question. Can you read it out to me again?
Oh, the question says, how can the Pico for synthesis be useful in a narrative synthesis of a mixed methods review? That I can't think what sort of answer one might have to that.
I'm trying to think of something more meaningful than just say yes. I think it would be useful to explore it. I mean, as I understood it, the Pico for grouping synthesis was not necessarily linked to the meta-analysis. It is about thinking about how you group studies together. So in a qualitative context, that would be worth exploring to see whether there's value in grouping the studies in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also helps you link studies across those different research methods. So to make sure that you're looking at the same populations, for example.
Yeah. Can I say something? I think partly there's some definitional questions for me around what is meant in this context by narrative synthesis. But if I take it to mean other than when we bring together results of studies to examine the effectiveness, perhaps using methods other than meta-analysis, then I think it certainly applies. So some of the methods we've talked about in chapter 12, it applies to that. So assuming that you're answering a question about the effectiveness of an intervention from, let's say, randomized trials within a mixed method review, then I think this concept certainly applies, irrespective of whether it's a meta-analysis or whether you're using one of the other synthesis methods that we've described that fall within what often is the broad banner of narrative synthesis.
There's a question here, which is from Andrew Booth, which is asking around whether we could use tidyr instead of the I in Pico for synthesis.
Yes, thank you for asking that question, actually, Andrew, because I think potentially in my presentation, because I have such an emphasis on the intervention component of the Pico, there's potential for people to be misled that in fact this is just about the intervention, which it absolutely isn't. It applies to all Pico elements. So we have made quite a lot of reference to tidyr as a framework for helping people think through the different elements of their intervention and how they might need to be addressed within their synthesis. But that is for the intervention component and of course for the comparators. But there's a separate process, parallel process for thinking about the outcomes. And then of course, there's the how you bring it together within a comparison for your actual analysis. And so the Pico for synthesis is intended to cover all aspects of this, not just the intervention. But tidyr is certainly an incredibly useful framework for that conceptual work you do around the intervention.
So we now open this up to questions. So please post those. I guess before we begin with the questions, I have a question for you all. Really, is that the poll results at the beginning said that 52% of attendees felt that their protocol was insufficiently detailed, and I just wondered whether you felt in any way for the topics that you've discussed, whether there are any kind of structural constraints within Cochrane, the Cochrane template. So, for example, missing headings that mean that authors might be unlikely to report the methods in detail that we might like them to. So there's no prompt there for them to do that. So maybe if we could begin with Matt, if you have a response to that.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. Good question. I think definitely, yeah, I think if you don't have a prompt, then you're less likely for authors to actually report on that stuff in the protocol, and even in the reviewers itself as well. So I know when it came to defining our outcome selection rules, I remember we were initially thinking, well, does this just go under the eligibility criteria under outcomes? And I'm pretty sure we did fit it under there, but it looked rather odd given that we had just a couple of lines about the studies and interventions and comparisons. But of course, we'll have a lot more lines now that we start adopting Pico synthesis. But at the time, we kind of just put the decision rules there. But that was really because of the research that you and I had been doing on selective inclusion of results, which led us to tell our collaborators we should start pre-specifying these rules. I don't think other people really will think of it. And having looked at even a more recent set of reviews, both Cochrane and non-Cochrane, I still don't see that many authors actually pre-specifying their methods for handling multiplicity, when I think there would be many benefits of them doing so. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Matt. Daniela, do you have any comment to add?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you repeat the question, please?
The question's about whether you think there's any kind of constraints within Cochrane protocols that mean people are not specifying the methods detail that they need to. So if you can consider that for adverse effects.
Yes, I think sometimes when we are planning the protocol of a Cochrane review, when it comes to pre-specify our outcomes, we sometimes have we struggle because there is a focus on the efficacy of the treatments, and the way we ended up you ended up following is that we have a primary outcome, and this is sometimes the approach many editors ask us to follow, and then the adverse effects ended up being in a mixed bag of secondary outcomes, and you cannot really pre-specify details that may be important for you to understand what outcomes you're going to be collecting data on, thinking about data analysis and so forth. So there is I struggle sometimes with that, but maybe a way to improve that is to stop considering adverse effects as secondary outcome, because they are handy. They go hand in hand with the efficacy. They drive decision making. So we may and we should start to think about them as maybe something like primary efficacy outcome and primary harms outcomes, and remember the harms outcomes when we start to planning our data extraction, synthesis, and so forth.
Right, that's really interesting. And Yemisi, did you have anything to add?
I think the structure that we've got in DTA protocols authors find quite helpful, because it helps them to think through things that they may not have considered, especially this issue around the clinical pathway, because it can be sort of really difficult, but then when they sit down with their clinical colleagues, they can talk through it. And we also encourage them not just to provide text, but also to provide a figure, which people find quite helpful. And thinking around the analyses as well, it can be quite difficult really to think about all the things you need to consider. And so to help authors, we've produced a presentation. One of our online distance learning modules is around planning analysis, and again, I think authors have found that to be quite useful.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I'm going to bring in one other person, Tian Jing, if you're still there, just because you didn't get a question in the first session.
Oh, I'm still here.
Oh, brilliant. So in terms of network meta-analysis, is the current Cochrane protocol template fit for purpose?
Not really. There's a paper published by the methods group that suggests sort of additional considerations for network meta-analysis. And Audrey, as well as Carrie, have been working with the methods group, trying to come up with an annotated protocol template for network meta-analysis, which will include, hopefully, all these additional considerations. We have a draft, and it's in the process of being finalized.
That's good to hear. And I guess at this point, I'd like to bring in Miranda to see whether there's any comments from Twitter, Miranda, that you'd like to feedback.
Thanks, Joe. So the conversation's been going on along in the background. There's no particular questions being raised, but people have been particularly liking, I think, where the presentations, Angela and all of you with the different kinds of reviews have been teasing apart those details that you might want to specify in the protocol that we might not all think of. So I think that's been really helpful.
Great, thank you, Miranda. And now I guess we'll go to some questions. Julian, have you picked out some that you think might be?
Well, there's a really nice question from Anthony Sunjaya. How far outside stating that a narrative synthesis would be conducted if pooling is not possible, as found in most protocols, should we pre-specify? I think that really relates to what Sue was talking about, and I know Sue and yourself, Joe, have written a chapter that's very relevant to this. I wonder if one of you might like to comment on that.
Yes, okay, I think I'll take that comment. I think that's a really important question, and it was a presentation that we obviously had within the symposium, but the situation where for many reviews, there are many meta-analyses where we only include a fraction of the studies that are available, and some reviews we don't have any meta-analyses at all. And so the question is, how far do you go in thinking about what other methods you might use. My view on this is that we should actually be much more careful in thinking about what analysis methods we might use if we can't use meta-analysis, or and also the kind of graphical figures and tables that we should present. So I think we should be more careful in pre-specifying this. And the reason for this is that it seems in many reviews that, and from the research that we've done, that as soon as people don't do a meta-analysis, it's a kind of grab bag as to how that information is presented. And the risk with not pre-specifying methods around that is that certain studies may be selectively kind of commented on or included in the text and reporting the results. So I think it would be something that personally I would be keen to have a section within the data synthesis or part of the protocol, or have a separate section that would be on what you do in lieu of being able to do a meta-analysis of effect estimates. So I'd be very keen for that.
Great, thanks. Sue, did you want to add anything, or should we move to another question?
No, I think that covers the issues nicely.
Excellent, thanks. Here's a question for Matt. I know you know the answer to this. It's a question from Leslie Barrio-Nuevo. Have you considered creating a chapter on how to handle bias related to conflict of interest studies?
We have already a chapter that is devoted to both assessing risk of bias within studies and conflicts of interest of the study authors. So that's chapter 7 of the handbook, which the latter half of that chapter introduces a framework for considering conflicts of interest within the included studies. And Asbjørn Robertson is leading a development of a new tool called TACIT, the tool for assessing conflicts of interest in trials, which will help authors provide a structured way of collecting information on conflicts of interest of their included studies, and have a think about how that can influence several aspects of the review, from the potentially influencing the risk of bias within studies, the risk of bias due to missing results in meta-analyses. So sometimes conflicts of interest can lead to a lot of publication bias, but also the assessing of the certainty of the evidence as well, in terms of what sort of comparisons are actually made within studies that may, for example, be industry funded versus non-industry funded. So definitely chapter 7 provides, I guess, a preliminary framework for thinking about those issues.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Do you have a plan, Joe? Because I think we could very quickly address 2 other questions.
You go for it, Julian.
So I can provide a quick answer and then see if any of the speakers have anything to add. One question from Michael Brown earlier on. Core outcome sets are, really important developments in people planning trials, and COMET, the initiative to try and bring those together. These are mentioned briefly in the handbook, but is there any unified Cochrane effort to develop these, or is it up to individual review groups? I think, as far as I know, there is no centrally coordinated effort, but it would be, certainly something worth thinking about. The other question, just to very quickly deal with, is there any guidance on how to define treatment burden outcomes, from Elaine Ashman? I don't think there's any in the handbook specifically for treatment burden outcomes, and I am not aware of anything. So that's a quick answer